Erika Miller is the Director of Training for DL Newslow and Associates, a 20-year veteran and training, auditing, and consulting firm based in Orlando, Florida. Miller earned her degree in chemistry from the University of Florida in 2005 and began her professional career as an analytical chemist. She worked for the state of Florida and in the byproduct sector of the Florida orange juice industry, most often using GCFID and GCMS analysis in addition to benchtop chemistry. Erika, take it away.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the introduction. Welcome to Exemplar Global's International Auditor Symposium. Today, I will be speaking on the Foreign Supplier Verifications Program rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act. We're actually going to be taking a look at this rule from a global perspective. Those of us that are in the United States have heard quite a bit about it, but it really affects companies that are located across the world, perhaps even more than those that are located in the United States. So most of us that are in the regulatory compliance realm have heard of FSMA. FSMA is an acronym that stands for the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it has made some incredibly sweeping changes to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in the United States. So all the foods that are regulated by the FDA have been regulated in more or less much the same way for a long time. And the government recognized they needed some new tools in their toolbox. So when FSMA was passed, there were actually 7 rules that make up the regulation. FSVP, or Foreign Supplier Verification Programs, is just one of those 7 foundational rules. The FSVP regulation requires that importers of food perform certain activities based on risk to verify that food they are bringing into the United States has been produced in what they call the U.S. level of public health protection. Basically, the FDA wants to make sure that no matter where the food comes from across the globe, we offer the same level of public health protection at a minimum as if it had been manufactured here in the United States. Something a little bit different from this type of verification than what we usually do in the food safety realm is that we also have to consider adulteration, even if it's not a food safety concern. And that may seem a little counterintuitive, but my meaning is there are times when food can be considered adulterated. For example, it does not meet a standard of identity. An example might be extra virgin olive oil that you purchase that has been cut half and half with sunflower oil. It's not going to hurt anyone, but it is adulterated and cannot be labeled as extra virgin olive oil. It would not be a food safety hazard, but an importer would be required to address these types of food fraud incidents in addition to food safety. It's also important that the importer be aware of allergen labeling requirements. Food has to be labeled according to the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, which is unchanged by FSMA, but requires that food be labeled in a very particular manner to ensure compliance with U.S. regulations. To make it even tougher, most of these importers are distribution centers, warehouses, and other people in the chain that have historically not been very involved with food safety regulatory compliance. So these activities that are required are very new to this sector. So we're going to talk a little bit about how businesses in the supply chain can all work together to ensure that everyone is compliant and nobody gets any surprises. Generally speaking, standard requirements, when we say standard requirements, this would be everything an importer would be expected to do if the food they were importing was subject to the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Most FDA-regulated foods will require one of these programs. So these standard requirements, for those of us that are used to regulatory compliance and food safety documentation, will seem familiar. But try to think of this through the lens of someone who does mostly paperwork processing and logistics, sales, and purchasing, and historically has not been involved in this part of the import process. The first step in the process is to perform a hazard analysis of the food that is being imported and include an evaluation of risk. And risk is made up of 2 factors, likelihood and severity. So for each food that is being imported, the importer must analyze the hazards that may come in with that food as it enters their facility. So a food hazard analysis can easily be based on Appendix 1 of the FDA's draft guidance for the current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls regulation, which is 21 CFR 117. That is actually another one of the 7 foundational rules of FSMA, but it's a fantastic resource for food hazard analysis. Appendix 1 of the draft guidance document includes tables that list all the hazards the FDA considers to be in different types of foods. So it can be an excellent place to start for a food hazard analysis. Then the importer must evaluate a supplier's compliance history with FDA regulations, bearing in mind the risk level of the food hazards that they have identified. So if a supplier has been subject to regulatory action from the US government, such as import alert, warning letter, or even a recall, it would be important to note that you know about that and you have records that demonstrate you've taken that into consideration when approving that supplier. So suppliers do actually need to be formally approved, and there should be some records that show that approval process. There are certain written procedures that are required. For example, there must be a written procedure to ensure food is only imported from approved suppliers. That's easy when you have a database that controls that information for you so that purchase orders can't be entered unless the supplier has been approved by quality assurance. But many, many distribution centers and other types of import facilities do not have those sophisticated computer systems. So it becomes more of a challenge to manage a procedure like that with pen and paper. So the supplier approval is one part. Then we must only issue purchase orders to approved suppliers. Then, on an ongoing basis, based on risk, the importer must also determine and apply verification activities. A verification activity could be something like reviewing records, sampling and testing of the product, or even a third-party audit. So the importer must determine which verification activities they will require and then demonstrate that they've actually carried those out. If a supplier, for any reason, does not act in a consistent manner with something that they have said, the importer must implement corrective action. And the importer needs to understand that a corrective action is a two-part process. There's an immediate short-term fix and then a long-term prevention of recurrence, also very important. The foreign supplier must be thoroughly reevaluated every 3 years or for cause, meaning anytime something happens, like a significant change or an adverse audit finding. This importer must identify themselves properly on the import paperwork, which is easier said than done. We'll talk more about that later. And finally, last but certainly not least, all the required records and documentation must be kept for the appropriate retention time under the law, which is usually 2 years. If records were kept but were destroyed by fire, water damage, or some other reason before the required retention period had elapsed, that importer would be held liable as if they had never made those records in the first place. So that retention period is extremely important, and it's just one reason some companies choose to keep records at a secondary location as a backup. So those are just the standard requirements for an importer bringing in the bulk of FDA-regulated food. That's an awful lot to do, especially when you consider that a distribution center could have upwards of 10,000 different line items of food. Each one of those should be evaluated individually. This is incredibly time-consuming, and nowadays most companies run very lean. They don't have the extra manpower and resources to do this work. So what are they going to do? We all need to work together in the chain. The compliance dates are passing. Importers are going to be asking their foreign suppliers, their global supply chain, for documentation. And the supply chain really is going to need to give it up. Sometimes part of the problem is that we all communicate, but documentation takes a little while to follow. Sometimes things are considered confidential or trade secret, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But we don't really have time to mess around because the compliance dates for this regulation are already passing. So the very first date actually passed back in May of 2017. So for large foreign companies, companies over 500 employees, you should already have a foreign supplier verification program in effect. So something a little funny about this rule, one might think that the FSVP regulation is based on the size of the importer. Generally speaking, the compliance date is based on the size of the supplier. The size of the importer only matters if that importer is very small. And very small is really very small at $1 million rolling average of total gross receipts, not profits. And that includes any subsidiaries or affiliates of that company. Generally speaking, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program compliance date comes 6 months after the supplier's compliance date for their applicable regulations. So that's very confusing. What it means is if those foreign suppliers were located here in the United States, they would be subject to certain regulation, whether that would be the preventive controls rule for human or animal food or the produce safety rule. So the FSVP date for that supplier is going to be 6 months after the compliance date for whichever rule would have applied to them were they located domestically. So if you're going to be putting food into the United States, you have to either comply with these regulations or demonstrate that you're offering an equivalent level of U.S. public health protection. So it's almost easier just to comply with the regulations, easier to prove anyway. But you do have the option to do a separate but equal measure that will allow you to offer that level of public health protection. So compliance dates are staggered. They run all the way out through 2020. If you're looking up a compliance date for a particular situation, I always recommend doing it online because they do change the compliance dates fairly frequently. They offer some extensions. So I would always recommend going to www.fda.gov and looking up the compliance dates if you ever have a question. So application and enforcement. So many companies are confused about what this regulation means for them. And then when they don't see any major changes in the import process, they think, oh, well, it must have been overblown. Maybe nothing really changed after all. Maybe they decided to roll it back. There's a lot of confusion. This rule was never intended to change the current import process. The FDA is going to ask for these records after the food has already entered the country. And we know the wheels of government turn slowly. So you can guess that it will probably be weeks, if not months, after that food has entered the country that the FDA will get around to asking for those records. The challenge of that is, heaven forbid the records don't exist for one reason or another. Now you're thinking about having to pull that food back off the market. That's really terrible when you're basically yanking the food out of the consumer's hand. It's very bad PR. So it's important that we make sure these records are in place before we bring this food in to make sure that never happens. So a refusal of cooperation, meaning if an importer refused to cooperate with this regulation, or if a supplier refused to cooperate, refusing to allow inspection or refusing to provide documentation, there are enforcement activities provided for in the law. Basically, the worst thing is import alert. You get placed on import alert and your food can no longer enter the country, period, full stop. Or you can get your facility registration suspended, meaning your FDA bioterrorism registration can be suspended. So then you can really no longer do business on an import-export basis because that number is required for everything. Another change to the regulation on the enforcement side is that bioterrorism registration now needs to be renewed every 2 years. So there was a lot of communication about that, so most companies have not had a problem. The challenge is that it does not renew based on the date you submitted your application. It renews based on the FDA's fiscal year. So if you applied in April, say, it doesn't matter. Your registration will still expire at the same time every year. I believe companies have until December 1st to pay their renewal fee to re-register every 2 years. So some companies have been caught unawares, not because they didn't know to register, but because the date was not when they expected it. So make sure that anyone for whom you are acting as an agent or representative understands that change. One of the very first things I always say when teaching a regulatory class is that words have meaning. And what I mean by that is that in regulations, words are defined very specifically. Words that we may use in conversation, colloquially, in one way, can mean something very different in regulations. So I wanted to go through a few of the most important definitions for this regulation and explain why they are just so important. Food. Food's pretty obvious. Anything that you eat or drink, put in your mouth, chew up, swallow, right? Well, yes, and. For purposes of this rule only, this is not true for the preventive controls rule or produce safety rule or anything else, but just for foreign supplier verification programs, the definition of food includes things like packaging and other food contact substances. Well, that's not something you chew up and eat, at least I hope not. The reason this is included only on the foreign supplier side is because it happens that food contact substances are not regulated the same way across the globe. So there may be substances that are banned in the United States but may be allowed in other countries. So packaging being brought in on an import basis needs to be checked to ensure that there isn't any kind of a banned toxic, substance in there, that there's not too much anything in that container that could cause a problem. The reason dietary supplements is on this list: many countries regulate dietary supplements as drugs. We in the United States regulate them as food. It is an important distinction, and it has a lot to do with the way these things are imported. When you fill out the import paperwork for dietary supplements, it's important to remember that these are food products and should be brought in as food, not drugs. It gets very, very dicey when the country you're importing from regulates them as drugs. It makes it tough. There's also a difference between dietary supplement ingredients and finished dietary supplements. They are regulated under different sections of the regulation. So it's not just the food that we think of. We've also got to make sure we have FSVPs in place and are ready to give documentation for items like primary packaging, even conveyor belts. So importer, this word importer, we are very used to hearing about importer because from a Customs and Border Protection standpoint, we've been importing food for ages. Well, this importer has a different definition than importer for Customs and Border Protection. Under the FSVP regulation, the importer means very specifically the U.S. owner or consignee of an article of food that is being offered for import into the United States. So it's not necessarily the entity that's filling out the paperwork. It is whoever owns it, which is an important distinction. And it's got to be someone in the United States. So typically, importer of record for Customs and Border Protection purposes can be located anywhere. So many companies don't realize that this importer's got to be somebody in the U.S. If there is no U.S. owner or consignee at the time of entry, then a U.S. agent or representative must consent in writing to act as the FSVP importer on behalf of that line item shipment. So this does need to be in writing. It does need to be signed by an authorized signatory of the company. It is not the same as your agent or representative for bioterrorism registration purposes. Many people get that confused. They think that this agent or representative is the same entity that agrees to act as your agent or representative for bioterrorism registration, and that's not true. This is a separate statement of consent. It needs to be renewed annually. So make sure you get that in writing if it's from a foreign facility asking a domestic facility to do this. The challenge exists that when there's two domestic facilities in the chain that both meet the definition of U.S. owner or consignee, for example, there's a distribution center and there's a retailer, and the retailer has a written purchase order for the food, in that case, the DC or the retailer could act in this capacity. There is no regulatory requirement for a signed statement of consent between two domestic parties. And the challenge in that is that obviously the unscrupulous among us could potentially ask someone or kind of force someone to be the agent or representative without their knowledge or consent. The FDA recognizes that this can happen and is equally as concerned about it happening as we are. To that end, the FDA has published a register of all the FSVP importers that have been entered since the beginning of this rule. If any of you would like to go on there and see if your company's name appears, please by all means do. And interestingly enough, you may find there are some errors on the list. All of my clients that I've assisted with looking themselves up so far have found their name appears more than once because it's being entered slightly differently from broker to broker. So make sure they all understand exactly how your name is supposed to be. Something as simple as putting a space in or no space, or how the words are ordered in a name can make a big difference. So when we talk importer, historically we've always meant importer of record. Importer of record is abbreviated IOR, and that is who everybody thinks of when you say importer. That's usually the broker that's filling out the paperwork. The FSVP importer is a separate importer. It may or may not be the same entity as the IOR, but it is the person that will be held accountable for FSVP requirements, meaning you better have some records and documentation there to review when the FDA is interested in that line item shipment. So, as I mentioned, a key difference is that the IOR can be an international entity and the FSVP importer does need to be a domestic entity. So it is possible for them to be the same entity or to be different. Just depends on who's doing the work for compliance. Another challenge in most companies, the purchasing department, the quality department, there's a big gap between who's filling out the paperwork and who's actually approving the suppliers, generally speaking. Most of the time when I talk to regulatory compliance personnel, they have no earthly idea who is the importer of record. They probably have several brokers that work for them as a company, depending on who the supplier is, what's the method of shipping, lots of logistical things that can change who you use as a broker. So it's really important to get a line of communication open with all your brokers and make sure that anyone in the company feels comfortable inquiring that needs to know about who would be the broker for a particular type of food to ensure the compliance with this regulation. Now, when we say foreign supplier, we are usually thinking of the entity from whom we purchase food. Well, your foreign supplier for purposes of this regulation may or may not be the entity from whom you actually receive the food. It's whoever manufactured, processed it, grew the food, raised the animal. So we have very long, very complex supply chains. There can be several different distribution entities in the line, brokers, aggregators, consolidators. Well, those are not your foreign supplier. You've got to get visibility back to the actual manufacturer of the product. So the documentation that you have on file needs to represent what's going on at that manufacturer or processor. So your broker, your distributor, they are likely not your foreign supplier. Sometimes it's easy to know who that supplier is, and sometimes it's less so. We will talk more about that. Another important concept is qualified individual. Everyone under this regulation must be qualified to do their jobs. Sounds simple enough. The challenge comes when you need to prove it. How can you prove that person is qualified to do their job? A job description and training certificates that match up with everything? Sure, that's great. Well, there are times under this regulation that you're going to be responsible for people at other companies to be qualified to do their jobs, like an auditor. You've got an auditor performing an audit for you. Is that auditor qualified to do that? The FDA anticipated that it might happen that under this regulation, companies would send people to do quote unquote audits of companies, like purchasing people or salespeople that visit them anyway on a regular basis. And they might not really look at the food safety plan, but they would call it an audit because they were on site. And so they put this qualified auditor concept in there. If you're going to say someone's doing an audit for you, you need to be able to prove they're actually qualified to do an audit. So most of the certification bodies out there will gladly provide you auditor qualifications. So you have to make sure anybody in your company that's going overseas to do these kinds of inspections can prove their qualifications. And training being important is a running theme throughout all these regulations, all of the 7 foundational rules of FSMA. So the FSBCA, or Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, has been tasked with developing an FDA-recognized curriculum for this rule. They have succeeded. They've also done the preventive controls trainings for human and animal food. So if you need a training course, you can go to the FSPCA website, and they have a listing of all the training courses that are offered, domestic, international, everywhere. The training for FSVP is not mandatory the way that it is for preventive controls, but I can't recommend it enough. This regulation is so picky, and there's so many details that you have to get right that you really want to make sure and educate yourself. You can't just rely on other people to do the work for you. You've got to trust but verify. It always seems to backfire when you place all your eggs in one basket with somebody else and you just hand wave away and think, oh, that'll be fine. I don't need to worry about it. Trust me, worry about it. There's a lot here. Some people are hearing lots of 4-letter words, so to speak, I guess, 4-letter acronyms that are going around for all these different regulations. And so it's easy to get confused because there's so many of them. A lot of people ask, is this the same as that PCQI thing I heard about? No, not really. PCQI thing, if PCQI is a preventive controls qualified individual. So that would be a qualified individual for purposes of preventive controls. So preventive controls are the 2 regulations, one for human food and one for food for animals, that were passed for manufacturers and processors of food. So generally speaking, if you're growing produce, you'll be subject to the produce safety rule. You're processing food, manufacturing food, then you're subject to the preventive controls rules for either human or animal food. So when you hear PCQI, that other 4-letter acronym that's floating around out there, that's referring to a person who's taken the training course for the preventive controls regulation, either for human or for animal food. So as an FSVP importer, you might be checking to see if there is a PCQI at your supplier, because you would need someone potentially who was qualified and preventive controlled at the supplier to be able to demonstrate qualification, if that makes sense. So PCQI, different thing. It does kind of overlap, so you might sometimes run into that. So the human food regulation was released on September 17th, 2015. Animal food regulation also at the same time. That's 21 CFR Part 507. It is possible some of your foreign suppliers may be subject to this rule. So animal food, food for animals, nowadays it needs to be treated very nearly the same as human food in a nutshell. And the FSVP regulation does apply to food for animals. The produce safety rule, some of your foreign suppliers may be subject to the produce safety regulation. So you may need to be able to demonstrate compliance with this one. So you're starting to see that an FSVP importer needs to have a wide-ranging understanding of all these different regulations. If you're buying a wide variety of foods, it's possible that you may need to be judging compliance to many different regulations. And these are just the FSMA regulations. Never mind all the others that were already in place and have not been changed, like infant formula, bottled water, dietary supplement GMPs, all those types of things. There are a few classes of food that are exempted from the FSVP regulation. So just quickly, I'll run through those so you can take a little bit of a breath. Foods that are regulated under seafood HACCP and juice HACCP. So seafood HACCP covers all fish and fishery products. That includes things like snails, frogs, and all of that, except for catfish, but those are regulated by the USDA, so they're still exempt, so you don't have to worry about them. Juice HACCP only applies to 100% juice products. They can be concentrated or evaporated, but there cannot be any sugar added or anything else. So 100% juice products and seafood products are still regulated under the regulatory HACCP that they've been regulated under since the 1990s. I can say anecdotally, however, that we are starting to see inspections ramp up a little bit just because of the renewed focus on food safety that FSMA brings across the board, not just on its 7 regulations. Alcoholic beverages, under certain conditions. When we say alcoholic beverages in this context, we're primarily talking about distilleries, spirits. It's anything that's over 7% alcohol. And generally speaking, it's the same type of facility that would be required to get a permit from the Department of Treasury here in the United States, and that would be regulated by TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. So most of your craft brewers, your small guys like that, are not going to be that sophisticated. So you've got to be thinking in terms of large distillery operations making spirits, generally. Foods for export, funny, but we don't care about that. They can go, I guess that's the other country's problem, so we're not worrying about anything that's going to be exported before it's consumed. USDA regulated foods are also exempt. And then any food export that gets returned. So, you ship it over, it gets rejected for specification, it comes back. That product is not being imported by intention, so it's not going to be subject to FSVP. LACF is kind of halfway exempted. When I say LACF, I'm talking about low acid canned foods. So this would include your canned vegetables, canned soups, things like that. Your LACF regulation was one of the first category-specific food safety regulations to come about back in the 1970s. Remember all the puffy cans, exploding cans that got people very sick from botulism? Well, when that regulation was passed, we didn't have the full holistic understanding of food safety like we do now, and so it only really addressed microbiological hazards. So in a similar vein, those types of foods are exempted from the FSVP regulation for microbiological hazards only. So you've got to be able to demonstrate compliance with 21 CFR Part 113 for microbiological hazards, and then you need to have an FSVP for chemical and physical hazards. So that's a very confusing exemption. It's like a half exemption. So when you are filing for exempted foods to come in, it's really important the broker understands exactly how to file that. Because, you can be bringing in an awful lot of line items in one container. So the broker may not fully understand the regulatory landscape for every single one of those products. So it's up to us to tell them, okay? Because they need to be able to fill out for every single line item entry that's coming in, what is that product specifically and whether or not it's subject to FSVP. You don't want them putting in that you're subject for something that you're not, obviously, because then you get requests for documents that you don't have. So purchasers really need to work very closely with their brokers to ensure each line item is properly coded for entry. So the purchasers may need to work with quality assurance or product developers, R&D, to make sure that happens. The FDA does have a guidance document available, and the link is here if anybody needs to go online and take a look at some guidance about exactly how you enter those codes. If the product is subject to the regulation, it's FSV. If it's exempt, then you enter FSX, but you've got to give a reason code. So you need to know why it's exempt. Is it seafood? Is it juice? What is it? Okay? So a common thing we have heard is I get an audit from SQF or BRC or FSSC 22000. I get one of these audits every year, so I'm golden. I don't have to worry. Yes and no. Again, it works like halfway. So let me explain. The GS Safety Initiative. It's an accreditation body. It's a global council that reviews certification schemes. So SQF is an example of a scheme or a certified program that companies can then use as a guide to develop their food safety management systems or quality management systems. So GFSI's role is to ensure that these schemes all meet sort of the same base level requirements. So there's several that have been approved. So SQF, BRC, FSSC 22000, and IFS all are GFSI approved certified programs. So generally speaking, they're very tough audits. They're days long. They come around every 3 years. They're unannounced. Every year you have an audit. So you really get put through the ringer to maintain this status. So it's kind of you would assume that this would be enough to demonstrate compliance with the US level of public health protection. Well, it does for verification purposes. So I don't know if you remember when we were going through the standard requirements, first you have to approve your suppliers, but then you have to have an ongoing verification component to demonstrate they remain in compliance. So the GFSI certificate by itself is not enough for approval. When you're going to approve the supplier, you need to research their compliance with FDA specifically. And the GFSI, if you're in another country, they're going to be looking at your local regulatory climate, not United States FDA, unless you specifically ask. So you want to make sure that when you approve the supplier, you actually look at their history with the FDA and keep a record when you do that, okay? And I always recommend using Google to do a site search of the FDA website rather than using the search bar on the FDA website. It works way better. There's an archive. Anything older than 5 years on that website gets archived. So if you want to see anything older than 5 years, you've got to use Google to do a site search or search the archive separately. So the GFSI approved audit certificate will work for supplier verification, but it's not enough by itself for approval. So the FDA oversight portion of this, a lot of companies are concerned about giving their trade secret and confidential information away. One of the most common pushbacks that you get when you ask for documents under this regulation is, that's confidential. I can't give it to you. Well, it really puts you in a tough spot because the FDA has clearly stated they want full farm-to-fork transparency and traceability. So the rule is not changing the current import process. Food still comes in the same way. These records are going to be given after the food's already here. So these companies that are bringing it in, they really need to know that they've got everything they're going to need because when the FDA comes around, they can't be pulling it back off the market. So the importers need to keep hazard analysis information, especially. The FDA is looking on the supplier approval side that the hazard analysis is done. So generally speaking, a lot of these companies are asking the suppliers for the hazard analysis because they're distribution companies, they've got thousands of different foods, they don't have the knowledge or the resources to fill out a food hazard analysis for every one of those. And often, the suppliers are saying, no, I won't send you my hazard analysis. And I would plead with those suppliers to reconsider and to please send your hazard analysis because it's really so very helpful for those importers that are trying to comply. So the importers will keep the documentation on file for at least 2 years in order for to demonstrate compliance. So then the suppliers say, wait, I heard about this thing where my information can get released to the public. And it is true that there is a thing called the Freedom of Information Act, and people can submit requests. And that information, it's possible that if there was that information involved with an investigation or something like that, it could be released in response to a FOIA request. But on food safety documentation, most companies really don't have anything to hide. Most companies do it the same way, unless a company is like not doing things right, which you probably wouldn't want to be doing business with them anyway because it really puts your brand at risk. There's really not that much different that most people do. Within a sector, from food safety perspective, there is usually industry best practice that everybody follows. Now, if your supplier is refusing to give you a hazard analysis, it starts to ring some alarm bells like, oh gosh, why don't they want to give it to me? Maybe I need to go there and check them out now. So it's really much easier for everyone if we can share the information. If there ever was a FOIA request, the agency, the FDA, has clearly stated that they will redact any confidential or trade secret business information prior to publishing. So you can always mark pages confidential. And hopefully that would be enough to keep most of that information from getting into the public realm. And also, FOIA requests are fairly rare, so it's probably somewhat unlikely that they would actually come to that. So another question that we hear is, how does the FDA have jurisdiction over these companies? They're not even located in the United States. How can they be telling us what to do? Well, food that is intended for consumption here in the United States technically falls under the jurisdiction of those agencies tasked with protecting our food supply, the FDA and USDA namely. So for FDA regulated foods, which make up about 80% of our nation's food supply, they do have the authority to regulate suppliers in foreign countries if they are intending that food to be eaten here. So the FDA has actually always conducted international inspections. I've met some of their international people personally, and they really fly all around the world and inspect companies everywhere, all types of companies. It's quite interesting. And they will continue to do that. But the responsibility for food safety and the responsibility for compliance lies with industry. And the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually laid that out, that industry was responsible for food safety. The FDA's role is just to spot check compliance. So the FDA's inspections will be just that, spot checks. Every line is not going to be reviewed every time, but you have to act as if it will, because you never know which one will be the one that will be chosen. So a little information on international inspections. The FDA actually publishes its manual for conducting international inspections. It is online. There's a link here in the PowerPoint, which I believe will be available for download after this is done. Establishment inspection reports, or EIRs, are available on the FDA website. That's also a link, that inspections database. Any citations that have been issued since 2008 are in this embedded spreadsheet here. So again, that's a link. It's an embedded spreadsheet on the FDA website, not my computer, thankfully. The FDA also has issued a guidance on what can be considered a quote-unquote refusal of inspection. So if they feel that a company is refusing inspection, and it's not just turning them away at the door. There's a lot of things in there like, you know, changing an appointment without giving a good reason, or suddenly stopping to answer the phone and not answering anymore. That maybe there could be other reasons why something like that could happen in a communication. So it's really important to understand what the FDA considers a refusal of inspection, because it's not just what you might think of in your mind, oh, that's a refusal, I'm turning you away at the door. If you are going to be out of the office for 2 weeks and nobody's returning their calls, that could be considered refusal of inspection. You can get put on import alert, and your food will always be DWP, detained without physical examination. Basically just turned right back around and shipped back to you at your expense. So equivalence is the concept. The FDA has evaluated the food safety systems of other countries to determine if they offer the same level of public health protection as we have here in the United States. So to date, the FDA has recognized Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as having food safety systems that are comparable or equivalent to our own. So there are other countries that are being evaluated and are expected to be granted their status, but it's a very long process. So if a product is manufactured or processed in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, and it's a finished product, it's not going to be manufactured further here in the United States, then all the importer needs to do is to verify that that manufacturer is in good standing with the relevant food safety authority. So some companies are like, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll take my food and I'll just put it in the warehouse on the US-Canadian border, and then I'll just ship it in when there's an order. No, because just warehousing, it doesn't count as processing or manufacturing. So remember, your foreign supplier is not the entity from whom you receive the product all the time. So that would be an example of a de minimis operation. It would be insignificant to the overall safety of the food. So you wouldn't be able to do that. It's not really a loophole. So the product that you're importing must be under the scope of the systems recognition agreement. So remember, dietary supplements, that's an example of where it might not be, because supplements are regulated as drugs in other countries. So the company's got to be in good standing, and you've got to be able to have the records to show you actually checked them out. So again, don't just assume, trust but verify. Make sure you've got those records to demonstrate compliance. So a lot of brokers, distributors, consolidators, aggregators, they have long relied on confidentiality to keep profitability. So brokers don't tell their sources, because if they do, some companies might buy direct. They're going to cut out the middleman and they're going to go straight to the source. So this law really interferes with that business model, because the whole farm to fork concept, yeah, it really doesn't play nicely with that sort of obfuscation. So the FDA, the preamble to the regulation is in the Federal Register. So on the day when they actually release a final regulation, they release a preamble, which is a bunch of answers to questions that people have asked. So the FDA actually addressed this exact situation. So they said that they understand this can happen. So the importer is allowed to get information from other entities. So the broker or the distributor is certainly able to give you the information that you need. You don't have to talk directly to the manufacturer or supplier. The documentation still needs to reflect the activities that went on at that manufacturer or processor. So the brokers are like, well, that doesn't really help me because I'm still telling them where it is. But it is what it is. That's the answer. So you can rely on work done by another entity as long as your qualified individual reviews and assesses the work and documents that review process. So don't just get it all and put it in a folder. Make sure you actually document the review process. So one way that brokers can address this potentially is to provide compliance services for this regulation. So if a broker is willing to act as the FSVP importer, I personally know of a bunch of companies that would jump on that because they are stretched way thin with this regulation. The information could be gathered and it could be a value-added premium service that's offered to clients that are willing to pay extra. So a lot of companies are really struggling with this FSMA compliance thing. So I would recommend if you're in that situation, educate yourself about this regulation and reposition yourself. Go get some food safety training and try a different approach. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on was the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. This is something that a lot of companies have heard about and they're not real sure what's going on. It is a little bit delayed. So this program is a fee-based program, costs about $18,000 a year. So there is one of the 7 foundational rules of FSMA is the third-party accreditation rule. So the FDA can require that a food that's being offered for import is accompanied by a certification from an accredited third party. Well, the FDA hasn't taken that authority and used it yet, but the mechanism also exists for companies to voluntarily submit to these audits. It's basically like a preemptive FDA audit. So you once a year have them come in and look at all your paperwork, and then if everything's okay, you'll be approved for the food supplier combinations for which you have the documentation on file. But this would be something for the importer. It is not for the foreign supplier. So if you are a global business outside the US, this really wouldn't apply to you. It would apply to entities that are inside the US that are going to be calling you up, asking you for lots of documents in order to demonstrate compliance. So the VQIP status actually elevates the action level for a food. So generally speaking, with imported foods, all the FDA needs is appearance of violation, like it smells funny, it looks funny to me, I don't like it. Then they can take action on the food. The domestic standard for action is a reasonable probability. So if you are a VQIP importer for an approved food supplier combination, the FDA would need a reasonable probability to take action on your food. They can no longer just hold your stuff at the border because, they felt like holding your container today. So the VQIP does allow for expedited review and entry of approved food supplier combos from importers. But the FDA, on these audits, these VQIP audits, those are mandatory reporters. So that means that they have to report to the FDA anything that's a potential serious risk to public health. So just bear that in mind when you're scheduling that audit. So this is the last slide I believe that I have. So importers need written procedures. Make sure that you as an importer have written procedures for these things. And I'm going to offer, hopefully we can upload with the presentation, some templates, some form templates that you can use that we developed, because in the curriculum for this particular regulation, they don't offer form templates like they did for preventive controls. So we developed a few, so hopefully they will be of help to you. And here's our contact information. Sorry.
Thanks, Erika. This ends today's presentation. Have a good day.